Welcome back. This is lesson 3 of week 7, and in this lesson, you'll learn how to make your programs more readable. So in this lesson, we'll briefly recap what we've already discussed this week about how to work in a team with other programmers. We'll discuss what readable code is and how to make our code readable, and review the really important reasons why we should make our programs readable. So when we make our code user-friendly, we're thinking about the experience of the user. Whereas when we make our code readable, we're thinking about the experience of other programmers who will look at our source code. Readable code is easier for us to understand next time we look at it, and it's also easier for other people in our team to understand. It will also be easier for people in the future to come back to our code and to fix it or maintain it or add to it. This ties in with what we've been discussing already about the importance of procedural thinking, breaking a problem down into smaller and easier to understand problems, and sharing the work in our team. Here's an example of a program that has not been designed to be readable. This program works, and none of the changes that I'm going to make this lesson will change the functionality of the code, but I'm going to work through it now and make it more readable. I'm going to use 3 strategies to make the code more readable. I'm going to look at the identifiers. That is the names that we've used to identify things, how the code is spaced and laid out on the screen, and adding comments that will explain the code. So let's go through those 3 steps one by one. First of all, identifiers. I've changed the identifiers in the code, and I think that's made a huge difference to how readable it is. In fact, you might now, if you didn't already, recognize what this program is. Identifiers in a program are the names that you, the programmer, have given to different parts of the code. We've only learned one thing that we can name, and that's variables. So what I've done here is I've named the variables. They were called A, B, C and X, but I've changed that to days, hours, minutes and seconds. So thinking about good identifiers will immediately help to make your code more readable. In general, identifiers should be explanatory enough that you can understand the purpose of the variable, but they mustn't be so long that it's hard to read and write the program. So you've got to strike a happy medium, but seconds, minutes, hours and days, they seem to do the job here. The next thing I'm doing to make my code more readable is to space it out. Python just ignores empty lines and also spaces like just a space bar. Unless the space is inside a string, Python just ignores it. So with clever use of spacing, you can set out your code to make it easier to read. I've done another couple of things here. I've made the code more user-friendly as well. So combining those 2 things, I think you'll agree it's getting easier and easier to read this program. And then finally, the third thing to think about to make your code readable is to add comments. Comments start with a hashtag. The hashtag can come at the start of a line or at any point in the line, but everything from the hashtag onwards in that line will be ignored by the computer. So I've put in some labels here, some comments. For instance, the second block of code where the user inputs seconds and it's converted to integer, I've put the label, these are the inputs. And then the second block below that, minutes are calculated as seconds divided by 60. And you'll notice that I've taken the remainder, that's what the percent sign is, the remainder of that calculation, and saved that as spare seconds, and so on through the program. So I've added comments. So just to remind that hashtag, anything that follows the hashtag is a comment. It's shown in red in idle, which makes them stand out, and the computer will simply ignore them. They're for the human reader. So let's go back to where we started. The code on the left is what I began with. I personally think that's unreadable. And on the right is the code, part of the code, as I've amended it to make it more readable. Imagine the difference between looking at one or the other of those programs. If you had to, let's say, make a change to it or check it, the readable one is longer, it's got more words in it, it takes up more space, but the gains are huge. So just to review the advantages of making our code readable, it's an advantage to you in the future because you will forget. You may not seem it as you're writing a program, but you will forget what your program is when you come back to it a few weeks later. It also really helps you with teamwork. If your team members, your fellow team members, can read and understand the code that you've written, it also means that your code has a future after you've gone. Perhaps you've been promoted or gone on to a new job, and your future colleagues want to find new uses for your code. And finally, we're sharing our code typically with an open source community. Not all code, some will be commercially sensitive, but we're sharing it with the people around us in the programming community. And if it's readable, they'll be able to understand it. So I hope I've convinced you about why it's important for code to be readable. Let's go back over that checklist of how we can make our code readable. The first comment there, I think, is the most important one. You should be thinking about readability as you code. Today, I showed you some unreadable code, and then I went through it and did things to it to make it more readable, but that's not the best way to do it. Your best bet is to be doing all these things as you write the code instead of coming back to it later. So make sure you choose suitable identifiers. The identifier we've been using so far is the variable. Make sure that your code is nicely spaced out. So different parts of the code will be doing different things, and most Python programmers space those chunks of code out by throwing an empty line in between them. And add comments with a hashtag, which are messages to the reader. Doing those three things will make your code more readable. So let's try and put this into action. So in this exercise, you're going to write a program to calculate and display the wind chill. That's the temperature after the wind chill factor is taken into account. What does that mean? Well, wind chill is the way that strong winds make us feel colder. You might have seen that on a weather forecast. The weather forecaster will say something like, oh, today it's 11 degrees, but with the strong wind it will feel more like 7 degrees, so wrap up warm. And for us that's nice to know, interesting, but for personnel working in Arctic conditions it might be almost a matter of life and death. They have to wear the right protective clothing, and if they don't think about wind chill, they might end up getting frostbite or hypothermia. For this reason, the Canadian government has developed a scientific formula to calculate wind chill with a great deal of precision. I'll show you the formula on the next screen. And your task is to create a program to calculate and display this temperature with wind chill taken into account. But more importantly than that, you've got to make sure that your program is user-friendly and readable. see it's quite a difficult formula, and it uses two variables, T and V, the temperature in Celsius and the wind speed in kilometers per hour. And I just want you to write a program to use this formula and take temperature and wind speed and output wind chill. If you get that done, you could convert the wind speed into miles per hour, because that's what we use in English weather forecasts. You'd have to change miles to kilometers in order to do the formula, but I will leave that up to you. So in the next lesson, we'll look at some further exercises to allow you to practice the programming skills that you have learned so far. Bye for now.